Sweet birch bark, the tree Cherokee healers brewed for pain and fever, contains methyl salicylate. That is the direct chemical cousin of aspirin. Not a similar compound, not a loose analogy. The same molecular family that Bayer patented in 1899 and turned into one of the most profitable pills in modern history. Cherokee people were already brewing it from the inner bark of a tree growing right outside their door. If one tree became aspirin, what did the other six become? And why aren't we still using any of them? That is not a rhetorical question. By the end of this, you will recognize at least 3 of these remedies in products sitting on a shelf you already walked past. Not as history. As active ingredients, absorbed, repackaged, and sold back to you without a word about where they actually came from. There are 7 trees on this list, and they did not each produce one vague folk guess. Together, they covered pain, fever, cough, throat, gut problems, wounds, skin infections, and immune collapse. Tree by tree, ailment by ailment. That is not a collection of curiosities. That is a pharmacy. In 1891, an ethnographer named James Mooney walked into Cherokee territory in the southern Appalachian region and began recording what he found. He was working through the Smithsonian. What he documented was not ceremony. It was not mystical tradition. It was a detailed, functional record of plant-based preparations, bark infusions, root applications, leaf soaks, each one tied to a specific complaint, each one carried forward with observable consistency across generations. This was not folklore. This was a working system, and it had an internal logic that runs straight into the present day. Start with sweet birch. Betula lenta. Cherokee healers prepared the inner bark and young twigs for pain and fever. What they were delivering to the body, without a patent filing, without synthetic chemistry, without a laboratory, was methyl salicylate. The exact same compound that Bayer chemists later isolated, modified, and formalized into acetyl salicylic acid, aspirin, patented 1899, sold to the world as a breakthrough. They synthesized it. Cherokee people brewed it. The chemistry was not poetry. The bark worked because of what was measurably, documentably inside it. A compound that directly targets inflammation and fever. The mechanism was real. The knowledge was precise. It predated Bayer's patent by generations and asked nothing for the credit. Now here is where it gets harder to ignore. Wild cherry bark. Prunus serratina. Cherokee communities used the bark of this tree for coughs and respiratory complaints. It worked by calming the cough reflex and easing irritation in the airways. What stands out is not simply that it worked. It is what happened to it once the pharmaceutical industry began formalizing. Wild cherry bark was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia. That is the official national reference for recognized medicinal substances. And it appears in commercial cough syrups to this day. The same bark, the same mechanism, the same original application, still active, still for sale. The pharmacy did not replace this remedy. It absorbed it, stripped the origin, repackaged the compound, and sold it back with a brand name where the source story used to be. If they put it in the cough syrup, why not tell anyone where it came from? Third tree, slippery elm, Ulmus rubra. The inner bark of this tree produces a dense, coating mucilage when it meets water. Cherokee healers used it for sore throats, coughs, and digestive complaints. It works by physically coating the irritated surface, throat, gut lining, and reducing inflammation through direct contact. Here is the detail that matters. You can buy slippery elm throat lozenges this week, right now. Brands like Thayer sell it. The FDA recognizes it as a safe and effective ingredient. It is not underground. It is not hard to find. It is sitting on a mainstream shelf, fully available, with no acknowledgement of where the original knowledge came from. It was never buried. It was just never credited. That pattern, absorbed, repackaged, origin erased, runs through this entire list. And the scale of it only becomes clear when you see all 7 trees together. Cherokee plant knowledge was not an isolated tradition. It was the working regional medical system for an entire geography, carried across generations. Early American settlers adopted these practices directly. Colonial-era herbal records document the crossover. This was ordinary household knowledge, practical, functional, widespread, until the infrastructure around medicine began to shift in ways that made some of it profitable and the rest inconvenient. By 1906, a federal law had begun drawing hard lines between what could officially be called medicine and what could not. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the beginning of a regulatory architecture that would determine which remedies received funding, research, and promotion, and which ones were quietly left behind because they could not be patented, and therefore could not justify the investment. The first 3 trees made it through. They were absorbed because the compounds inside them were extractable, synthesizable, and profitable. The next 4 were handled differently. One of them was banned outright by the federal government, not quietly deprioritized, not simply neglected, banned, by name, in an official regulatory document. I am not naming it yet, but stay with me because that is the part of this story that should make you the angriest. White oak comes next, Quercus alba, and this one shifts the whole picture. The first 3 trees worked internally: pain, fever, cough, throat, gut. White oak bark worked on the outside. Cherokee healers prepared a wash from the bark and applied it directly to cuts, skin irritations, and wounds. They also used it internally for digestive complaints. The mechanism is tannins. Oak bark is extraordinarily rich in them. Tannins are astringent compounds. They literally tighten tissue on contact, reduce weeping, create a temporary barrier, and carry documented antibacterial action that modern plant science has confirmed across multiple studies. This was not one shelf of the pharmacy. This was a different aisle entirely. Think about what that means across the full list so far. Pain and fever, cough suppression, gut and throat coating, wound care, 4 distinct systems, 4 distinct trees. A working approach to the most common complaints a human body generates, developed without synthetic chemistry, without a supply chain, without a distribution network, built from what was growing within reach. Now the 5th tree, and this one gets a little strange: black walnut, Juglans nigra. Cherokee healers used the hull of the black walnut for skin conditions, ringworm, and what were described as parasitic complaints. The compound responsible is called juglone. It is the same substance that makes black walnut toxic to surrounding plant life. You may have noticed that grass doesn't grow well near a black walnut tree. That is juglone at work. And in the hull, at the concentration Cherokee healers were applying topically, juglone has been studied in university-linked plant research for its antifungal and antimicrobial properties. The results were not negligible. They were specific and repeatable. Here is what most people miss. Black walnut is not exotic. It grows wild across a vast stretch of North America, from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. The hull is not a rare substance. It is a byproduct of a tree that drops fruit every autumn in suburban backyards, along roadsides, through open woodland. Right now, black walnut hull extract sits in supplement aisles in standard health food stores. Nobody is hiding the tree. They just quietly stopped explaining why the knowledge existed in the first place. 6th tree, and this one carries the single most striking individual fact on the entire list: white pine, Pinus strobus. Cherokee healers used the bark and needles for respiratory complaints, coughs, congestion, and colds. The respiratory angle alone would be enough to include it. But the real story is in the needles. White pine needles contain measurably high levels of vitamin C. Documented, confirmed, not estimated, measured. When French explorer Jacques Cartier's crew was dying of scurvy in the St. Lawrence Valley. In the 1530s, indigenous guides showed them how to brew the needles of a pine tree. The men recovered. Cartier recorded it. That account has been in the historical record for nearly 5 centuries. The tree that keeps people alive through winter. One of the most common trees in North America, growing in backyards, along highways, in every park across the northeastern and southeastern United States. You may have walked past it this morning. Now here is the part nobody tells you, And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to wave away. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was the beginning, but it was only the first layer. As the 20th century moved forward, the FDA's authority expanded. The standards for what could be studied, promoted, marketed, or labeled as medicinal became increasingly governed by a system that required expensive clinical trials, patent-backed investment, and regulatory infrastructure that individual plants, things that grow from the ground, that nobody owns, that cannot be exclusively controlled, could never realistically clear. It was not a conspiracy meeting in a back room. It was a structural outcome. When a remedy cannot be patented, no corporation will fund the research to prove it works. When no research gets funded, no approval follows. When no approval follows, the remedy gets quietly categorized as unproven folk tradition. And when it gets that label, a century of ridicule takes care of the rest. Not forgotten by accident, made inconvenient on purpose. James Mooney's records, the same Smithsonian fieldwork introduced at the beginning of the story, sat in academic archives for decades. In the 1970s, a wave of ethnobotanists began returning to those records. Researchers started cross-referencing the Cherokee plant preparations against emerging phytochemical data. What they found, paper after paper, was not embarrassing approximation. It was functional alignment. The preparations matched the mechanisms. The applications matched the compounds. The system was coherent. Those papers stayed in academic journals. They did not become public health guidance. They did not become school curriculum. They did not become the labels on the products that absorbed the same ingredients and sold them at a premium. The proof was always there. It just never made it to the people who needed it. And now, the seventh tree, sassafras. Sassafras albidum. This one I have to be straight with you about, because it is the most complicated entry on the list, and it deserves honesty, not theater. Cherokee healers used the root bark of sassafras as a spring tonic, a cleansing preparation consumed seasonally. It was widespread across the Southeast, not just among Cherokee communities, but across the broader Appalachian and lowland South. Adopted into general American folk medicine, brewed as a tea, used as a flavoring, eventually incorporated into early root beer recipes. Then in 1960, the FDA banned saffrole, the primary oil extracted from sassafras root bark, as a food additive. The basis was animal studies showing liver damage at high doses. The concern was real enough to act on. But here is the tension that deserves a moment. One compound, isolated, concentrated, administered to animals at doses far removed from the way it had been used across centuries of seasonal, moderate, traditional preparation. And on that basis, an entire tree's cultural and practical history was effectively erased from the public record. The remedy that sustained communities as a spring tonic for generations became a banned substance in a single regulatory document. That is not editorializing. That is the sequence of events. Now bring all of this back to where you are standing right now. Slippery elm throat lozenges are in your pharmacy this week. Black walnut hull is in the supplement aisle. White pine grows along the road you drove to work on. Slippery elm, wild cherry bark, and white oak tannin extracts appear uncredited in products you have already purchased. You do not need to rebuild a pharmacy from scratch. You need to know what you are already walking past. The aspirin in your cabinet came from a birch tree. The cough syrup ingredient came from a wild cherry. The throat lozenge came from a slippery elm. The scurvy cure that saved sailors was a pine needle. And the one remedy they actually banned it not because it was useless, but because the compound it contained was potent enough to require a serious look. And the system that governs these decisions is not built to honor what it cannot own. The people who know this look at a forest differently. They see something that was once an entire working system, not primitive, not accidental, not vague, developed with precision, proven through generations, documented by outside researchers, and then absorbed, diluted, stripped of credit, or quietly regulated into the margins. That is what these 7 trees represent. Which one surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. I want to know which tree you are going to look up first. And if you think the trees were something, wait until we go underground. The roots and bark beneath the soil carry knowledge that makes this list look like the introduction. We are just getting started.